mobile sources, so the way we move around different areas, tends to create a lot of air pollution, be it movements through the sky with airplanes, which is a key contributor of several air pollutants, or on the ground through cars, trucks, buses, etc. These tend to be a key source of both particulate matter and other harmful air pollutants. And then lastly, a lot of our economic activity is what we call stationary source of pollution. So operation of industry, power plants, sewage treatment, other stationary sources that are things we've built up and we use to perform a lot of economic activity contributes greatly to air pollution problems. So what do policymakers do about these sources? Well, there's, not surprisingly, lots of different policies aimed at addressing air pollution, and they tend to line up with each of these different sources of air pollution. We've got a lot of different policies that target mobile sources. Fuel standards are a common policy we see. Transportation technology standards. Every car has a catalytic converter. This was a requirement in the 60s and 70s that was first introduced as a way of reducing air pollution from transportation. When we think of stationary sources, there's a whole host of different policy choices that we can pick from. Industrial technology standards, so mandating the technology that must be used by some of these industrial facilities. Cap and trade programs, pollution taxes, so these are what are called economic mechanisms or economic policies aimed at reducing pollution. Or production permits and production restrictions, which can flat out say, here's a cap on emissions for air pollution reasons. And so there was one blog I shared with you written by Reid Walker that talks about a paper he has with Joe Shapiro that looks at one of these mechanisms in the US. When we think about the way we use area and the way the landscape affects air pollution, we even have policies in place here. Building energy codes, so thinking about cities and trying to make them less energy intensive and thus creating less pollution. Even zoning laws, where you can or cannot build. It can be both directly related to limiting the source of pollution, as well as changing where you're exposed to pollution. And then lastly, we even do things to try to manage natural sources of air pollution. Wildfire and forest management, one of the big implications of this is it can seriously reduce PM exposure in nearby communities. Even zoning laws, there's some new economic research that talks about the role of zoning laws in reducing the frequency and severity of forest fires. The idea being if we build close to forests, well, we're more likely to cause forest fires, which create all sorts of problems, including air pollution. So my area is really focused on stationary sources, and I think in particular trying to understand industrial sources of air pollution and how policy affects these industrial sources. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit more about these industrial sources and try to get a sense of where does this pollution come from and what can policy do to try to reduce that pollution. So let's use that as a framework to talk about the mechanics of aggregate industrial pollution. So I just talked about air pollution is really bad. It imposes lots of costs on humans in addition to the environment and animals. And there's lots of different sources of air pollution. So it seems like, well, everything's bad news. We're in for a lot of trouble. Fortunately, at least in the industrial sector, air pollution has fallen a lot recently. So some evidence of this is what's up on the screen here. So what this figure shows is a graph taken from a paper by Reid Walker and Joe Shapiro, so two authors of that paper I just talked about. This is a different study that we're talking about here, though. What this shows is trends in manufacturing air pollution emissions over time from the United States from 1990 to around 2008. And so this is very similar to that Eric Levinson paper I shared with all of you. The basic implication here is that industrial pollution has fallen dramatically, at least in the United States. This shows air pollutants for most of these 7 criteria air pollutants that I talked about. What this shows is between 1990 and 2008, emissions in aggregate from the manufacturing sector in the US have fallen between 50 and 60% for most of these air pollutants. So we're talking about really substantial changes over a pretty narrow time period. And so this good news leads us, sort of begs the question of where does this change come from, and what role has policy potentially played in this cleanup? And so in terms of this first question, thinking about what's the potential source of this aggregate change, the literature in this area has appealed to a seminal paper by two economists, Grossman and Kruger, that first appeared in 1993, that was thinking about the relationship between trade and environmental quality. And their argument was that trade doesn't necessarily lead to an environmental quality to deteriorate. And their basic argument was that trade can affect the environment through three different channels. There's a scale effect or channel, this idea that trade potentially increases economic activity. If economic activity creates air pollution, this scale effect will lead to higher emissions. There's a composition effect. Trade might change what an economy produces, which might create more or less air pollution. And there's a technique effect. Trade might cause us to change how we produce goods and services, which might cause air pollution on a per unit basis to either fall or increase. So this was really framed at understanding trade. But as it turns out, the implications of this are actually much broader than trade's effect on the environment. We can really use this scale, composition, and technique effect framing to think about the sources of industrial pollution regardless of the cause. And this is really becoming the dominant paradigm to think about how industrial pollution in aggregate has changed over time. And the idea is this really provides a roadmap for understanding changes in aggregate industrial pollution. And one of the reasons this has become the dominant paradigm is that this arises pretty naturally from a simple accounting identity. So this is essentially what Eric Levinson walks through in that 2015 paper I shared with you. The way we think about this is, well, let's imagine there's an economy and we want to understand what's happening in the manufacturing sector. And let's suppose there are n different manufacturing industries that compose that sector. Then we can reflect the total pollution emitted by that sector, capital Z, as the following decomposition. So total sectoral pollution is just equal to the sum of sectoral or of industrial pollution from each industry. So if we do that, we can then say, well, we know something more concrete about industrial emissions or emissions from any given industry, which is that we can break this down into a scale and a technique component. So an industry Z, or an industry I's total pollution Z, is equal to the amount of production that occurs in that industry multiplied by the technique used by that industry. And so this technique term is what we call pollution intensity, which is just defined as the amount of pollution emitted per dollar of output produced. And so this is another mathematical identity. Well, as it turns out, we can rearrange this a little bit and express this sectoral air pollution as the sum of total sectoral output, which is just X, multiplied by each industry's share in industrial activity, which is this var phi here, multiplied by that industry's emission intensity, which is capital EI, and then adding all of these together for all possible industries in the sector. So this is all a mathematical identity, and it turns out that identity is really nice because it maps perfectly to the scale, composition, and technique framing. If we take logs and totally differentiate that previous equation, we end up with the following relationship, which says that the percentage change in sectoral pollution, which is labeled Z hat, is equal to the percentage change in production activity in that sector, which is what we call the scale, plus the composition effect, which takes the industry's share, each industry's share of air pollution and some base year, and multiplies it by changes in the relative size of that industry. In other words, changes in the share or the composition of these industries leads to a change in total pollution, and a technique effect, which says, well, each industry might exhibit changes in air pollution intensity, and if we weight that by their share in the overall production of this sector, adding this all together gives us information about this technique effect. So this is really the way most people have been thinking about changes in aggregate industrial emissions as of late. It's useful conceptually, so we can say, well, if we observe manufacturing pollution declining by 50 to 60% in the last 2 decades, we can say, well, it's either coming because there's been reductions in scale, it's coming because there's been changes in composition, or changes in technique. And this gives us a way to generate useful stylized facts about what's happening in terms of industrial emissions. And this is essentially what Levinson is trying to do. He's taking this Grossman and Kruger idea really seriously and trying to get estimates of each of these channels. And so Levinson essentially operationalizes this by figuring out how you can construct that decomposition in a way that works with observed data. And his goal is essentially to show how much of the cleanup is due to what he frames as technology. So he's saying this technique effect is really related to technology, how much of it is responsible for this cleanup, versus how much is the change in the mix of goods manufactured in the US. So he uses some data to do this, data on pollution from the US's National Emissions Inventory, and data on production by each industry from something called the NBR CES Manufacturing Industry Database. Again, these are both publicly available data sets if anyone is interested in this type of data for your own sorts of work. And this is what you get. So basically, this is one of the key takeaways from his paper. This shows what's happening to sulfur dioxide emissions in the United States, breaking it down into the scale, composition, and technique effects. So the bottom line here, labeled number 2, shows what's happened to actual observed SO2 emissions from manufacturing in the US from 1990 to 2008. What you see is, well, like we already saw before, there's been a huge reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions. Number 1 shows how much of this is responsible due to scale changes. Well, clearly, if it was just changes in the size of manufacturing as a sector, we would actually have seen about a 35% increase in SO2, so that is not explaining what's happening. Number 3 here, this slightly lower line, incorporates changes in composition, so this is that composition effect, and what it shows is, well, composition would have led to lower emissions than just scale on its own, but it still would have caused an increase in emissions in aggregate. And this last term, 4, is the technique effect. And so what it clearly shows is that almost all of this cleanup for SO2 is because industries themselves are becoming less pollution intensive. This is this technique effect. And so what he says is, in terms of his conclusion, is that technology is what's the driver of this cleanup. And so he's saying there's been technological changes that have caused air pollution emissions to fall, and we see that through the technique effect. And now there's been applications of this idea in many different environments across the world, looking at what's happening in Europe, looking at the US, but examining products rather than industries, looking at China. I have some work that does this for Canada, and all the results are essentially the same. There's this really big technique effect, and that's what's causing this aggregate change in manufacturing emissions. And so if you're interested in terms of Canada, this is a table from one of my papers that essentially does the same exercise for Canada for a number of different pollutants. What we see is, well, emission intensity for the sector as a whole has plummeted throughout the 90s and 2000s by upwards of 60% for each pollutant. And almost all of this is due to the technique effect. So in Canada, we're seeing pretty much the same thing that Levinson documents for the US. And so Levinson's interpretation is it's all technology that's causing this. If that's true, then the thing that's causing this technique effect, changes in an industry's pollution intensity, must be solely due to changes in how firms in that industry produce. An alternative possibility is changes in industry level air pollution, or air pollution intensity, might be caused by changes in the composition of firms in that industry. So the basic idea, which is starting to move us to the more modern literature, is to say, look, this is useful, but if we really care about understanding the role of technology versus other changes in the economy, we actually need to observe firm level data in order to further complement this macro, or this sort of big sector level study. And so it turns out you can use this same decomposition methodology to try to understand how an individual industry cleans up over time. So to see this, we can take an industry's emission intensity, this EI, which we've defined as the ratio of that industry's pollution divided by the total amount of output in that industry. And what we can see is that, well, actually, this is a weighted average of the individual emission intensities of all firms that comprise that industry. So this integral is just basically saying, if we add all emission intensities that we can observe at every firm that comprise industry I, we call each firm's emission intensity little EIN, and we appropriately weight it by the share of that firm in the industry's overall activity, this is another way we can measure the overall emission intensity of the industry. And so, not surprisingly, we can do the same thing we did with the sectoral decomposition and use this to perform a decomposition at the industry level into firm level factors that contribute to this cleanup. So without getting into too much of the detail here, what we basically can see is the observed technique effect, a change in an industry's pollution intensity, can be further decomposed into a process effect, a reallocation effect, and a selection effect. So this process effect is changes in how firms produce. So this would be changes in an individual firm's pollution intensity as a source of that overall technique effect. Reallocation comes from relative expansion or contraction of relatively dirty or clean firms, whereas selection comes from entry and exit of firms into this industry. So the basic idea here is we have two ways in which the composition of the industry could change, either because some firms are exiting or new firms are entering that look different than the average firm in the industry beforehand, or we're changing the weight we give to each firm in terms of their amount of activity they account for in the industry, and that is causing the composition to change in a way that makes the industry less pollution intensive, or firms are simply producing in a way that creates less air pollution. And so now this is starting to get us to the state-of-the-art literature, because this raises an actual question of how big are each of these channels behind this technique effect. And so there's some new work that is trying to answer this. There's a paper by Holliday and LaPlue that's coming out in the Canadian Journal of Economics soon, if not already. And what they try to do is estimate this for the US performing the same decomposition using this firm level data. And say they use the EPA's toxic release inventory. This gives information on facility level toxic pollution. This is also publicly available. And then they match this with a private data set that gives facility level production information. And together they can construct a measure of pollution intensity at the firm. And they use this to study this cleanup of several different criteria air pollutants throughout the 90s. So this is a kind of the key takeaway from this paper. What this is showing is what's happened to volatile organic chemicals throughout the 90s from US manufacturing. The bottom line here shows the aggregate change in VOC emissions for this sector throughout the 90s, so an 80% reduction. The top line shows the scale effect. So just like Levinson was showing, they try to figure out how much of this is due to manufacturing scale. Not surprisingly, none of it. Scale would have led to an increase. Number 2 here, these triangles at the very top show scale plus composition. So trying to add in composition to see how much of the cleanup that explains. Well, as it turns out, that doesn't explain any of it as well. So that's kind of the same result we saw from Levinson's paper. Number 3 here is adding in this process effect. So changes in facility level pollution intensity. Now we start to see that this is getting us closer. So this suggests that a good chunk of the technique effect is due to changes in processes at individual facilities, but it's not all of it. Some of that is also compositional changes, and that's what that gap between number 4 and number 3 show. So the key implication is compositional changes because of reallocation and selection have caused some of this technique effect, but there's still evidence of some deeper technological change that we call the process effect. And so now you might say, well, how do firms reduce or change their emission intensities? And so in theory, you can extend this decomposition all the way into the sub-firm level. And there's a paper by a couple of good Canadian economists, Jevon Chernachon, Brian Copeland, and Scott Taylor, who show how to do this. I'm not going to take you through the details, but the basic idea is, well, imagine a firm creates output by performing a set of tasks. As long as each task creates different levels of pollution, then what we can do is use changes in the observed importance of relative tasks to decompose the process effect even further. So what they're saying is, some of this process effect might be due to changes in technology, but some of it might be due to changes in the composition of tasks performed by this firm. And so they organize this in a bunch of different categories. They call one firm reorganization. This is shifting to cleaner tasks, would allow you to become a little bit less pollution intensive. They talk about domestic outsourcing. This is moving some task that's relatively polluting from your own facility to someone else's facility in the same country. This would make you look cleaner, even though air pollution in Canada is still changing. Offshoring, this would be, well, if you remove some of the tasks that you are currently doing in your own facility and get that done by someone in another country, this would shift air pollution from your own facility abroad, and that would be a source of this process effect. There's also a markup effect. So because we're measuring pollution intensity in per dollar terms, if we change the price we charge for any given task, this would make it look like we're actually cleaner. And then the last is what they call a true technique effect. So this is really the core of technological changes. If for some reason we can become cleaner with the way we perform a given task, this will be a source of this process effect. And where the current research frontier is trying to figure out estimates of each of these firm level determinants of this process effect. So no one's been able to do this so far. There's a couple of key reasons. One is this is a new idea. The other is data limitations. You need to think of creative ways to assess this information because a lot of it is unobserved or at least imperfectly observed. So that's really the state of the literature on thinking about the mechanics of aggregate industrial pollution. We've started with the full aggregate and we've used decomposition exercises to get narrower and narrower and narrower, trying to get at this question of how important are technological changes for this aggregate phenomenon. Part of the reason we were so motivated doing this is trying to understand how policy has contributed to this trend. So in principle, policy can affect industrial pollution, again, using this same basic Grossman and Kruger setup. It might change the size of a sector, the scale effect. It might change the composition of industries in the sector, a composition effect. Or it might change the pollution intensity of individual industries, a technique effect. And as we just said, well, we know the technique effect is composed of selection and reallocation, changes in the composition of firms within an industry, as well as the process effect. So if we think about the literature on this, the early literature essentially looked at environmental policy's effects, not through this framework, but by trying to understand, well, how does policy affect the costs and profitability of regulated firms? And the basic implication is it should increase costs and it should make firms less profitable. And it may also require firms to upgrade technology. If we add on to this an understanding that most firms or most forms of policy only regulate highly polluting industries, and we might see general equilibrium effects created by costs being passed on to some consumers, what this really suggests is the scale effect of policy should be small, and the composition effect should be relatively large, and it's unclear about the technique effect. So we see firms may upgrade technology in response to these policies, but we need to understand some of the general equilibrium implications to get a sense of the relative size of these effects. So the newer literature has then complemented this by introducing firm heterogeneity in order to understand within industry competition and what that means for environmental policy. And what this suggests, paired with technological changes, is that the technique effect should really matter. So in theory, the technique effect should matter through all three forms of selection, reallocation, and process. What we have right now is a lot of evidence of selection and reallocation, and much less evidence of the process effect. So really where the empirical literature is on understanding the way regulation affects this aggregate cleanup is trying to understand this process effect in more detail. We need more estimates of the relative magnitude of this process effect. And we have almost no evidence of the mechanisms that cause this process effect. So we don't know much about how policy affects true technique, markups, offshoring, outsourcing, or reorganization. So this is really, in my view, where the literature needs to go. The key takeaway from all of this discussion on environmental policy is really environmental policy should change industrial pollution in many different ways, depending on the design of that policy and the context in question. So you can think of lots of different examples. Technology standards mandate technological changes, so this should create a true technique effect. Air quality standards only regulate firms in a particular set of regions, which means they should create reallocation and selection effects. If we have imperfect competition, then even something like a pollution tax might lead to markups, which would be a component of this process effect. And any policy that targets a certain subset of industries should directly create composition effects. So really the key implication here is because there's a lot of different sources of pollution and a lot of different forms of environmental regulation, the way regulation may have caused this cleanup is really hard to say, and we need to really look at individual examples to unpack this observation. Okay, so that's all I wanted to share with you today, give you a sense of what the literature has come to and what that means for some of these policy discussions.
All right, thank you very much, Nouri, for this very beautiful presentation. So I'm giving the floor to students who wants to ask the question regarding this presentation right now. And after that, we can start the Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can start asking questions.
I do have one question regarding the presentation. I'm having some, and this is going to be reflected if we get to our future question later, but I'm having some difficulties imagining how easy it can be, or rather how incredibly difficult it can be to look at the specific effects of one government change in policy. For example, the implementation of a carbon tax on one specific firm's decision to change their technology versus, for example, shut down a production plant in the specific area where it happened. And this is again going to be echoed later in our question, but is it accurate to say that the way we're modeling it leaves some uncertainty there in terms of really following that sort of effect down the pathway?
Okay, so a great question. And the key implication here is there are essentially two approaches, and these are really reflective of empirical approaches or empirical methodology that you want to use. So one is to use a quasi-experimental framework and look for a policy change that you can make a really strong causal claim about. Now, as you alluded to, that's very challenging in this environment because there's a lot of different potential effects of any given policy, and isolating these effects individually directly contradicts this idea that you can observe in isolation the consequences of one policy. So, for example, if you saw BC implement a carbon tax, which they did in 2008, you might say, great, let's use this to study the process effect, or let's use this to study selection and reallocation. And we want to isolate the composition effect from this study. Now, the problem here is BC is a part of Canada broadly, and we have an open market for the exchange of goods and inputs across the country. So as a result, a regulation that affects BC might have indirect implications for firms in Ontario, and that's going to actually affect your ability to make a causal claim about some of these channels. So, but in principle, one approach is to look for neat examples that allow you to make a causal claim about at least some of these mechanisms. And then you can actually pair that in one of these decomposition frameworks. So if we think about, if you want to understand the role of reallocation, if you can get a causal estimate of a policy's effect on a plant's emission intensity, not emission intensity, the share of a plant in a particular industry, this term here, and you observe some of this other information like their share of the industry prior to regulation and the overall change in pollution intensity of the industry, you can then use that to get an estimate of the reallocation effect caused by that one particular policy. Now, it all hinges on the causal interpretation of this, which is really challenging. The alternative is to recognize, okay, all of these things are compiled together. If we have a model that we're willing to trust, that reflects the interactions between firms and the economy, then what we might be able to do is use a quantitative model to back out these estimates. And so these are the two dominant approaches here. I alluded to, I think, the very first figure I gave was from a paper by Joe Shapiro and Reed Walker. This paper is a quantitative modeling exercise. So they say, well, we want to get at these different channels, but it's hard to causally identify different ones. So we're going to put a model together. We're going to present some argument as to why we think we can identify the different parameters we need and use them to construct counterfactuals to explain these trends. Alternatively, you can do that sort of causal policy analysis framework. And the idea is that the kinds of questions you can ask are going to vary across these, and they're always going to be faced with that exact critique. So it's a really good question.
Thank you, That does definitely clear it up.
All right. If you have any other questions, you may ask. So the last question regarding the presentation, if you have. All right. Okay. So now let's start the Q&A part. So I'm going to ask 5 groups to ask their questions. So it starts with group 3, and then 5, 2, 11, and 9. Okay. So first group is 3, and then group 5, group 2, group 11, and group 9 are going to ask the questions here. So group 3 is going to ask the question.
I'll ask the question. So a little bit of background to start, and then question at the end. The fixed costs of cleaning up production have been prohibitively high for many firms. Now, assuming diminishing marginal returns on investment in cleaner production processes, there's a limit to pollution reduction under a framework of efficiency. As fixed costs rise and the marginal benefits on pollution cleanup fall, eventually the costs exceed the benefits for even the most productive firms. Once this limit is reached, the impact of the process effect will decrease to zero, and there will be no quote-unquote cleaner firms to reallocate production to. As a result, reductions in air pollution will stagnate until a new method of regulation is adopted. If long-term pollution targets are set to zero, how can the law of diminishing returns be circumvented by policy to incentivize firms to clean up past an efficient point?
Okay, that's another good question. That's a tough question. So, first of all, the opportunities for any of these particular channels, particularly this process effect, like you indicate, really tie directly to the nature of abatement costs for a particular pollutant. And so, and the sort of technological options that potentially exist. And so you mentioned this point about fixed costs associated with abatement, and then also diminishing returns to abatement activities. This is actually really important because there's kind of a few different ways you can think about the technology behind abatement. If you have a fixed cost, this actually implies that abatement technology exhibits increasing returns to scale. So if that's true, then reallocation potentially reduces kind of the unit cost associated with abating pollution. And so there's potential tie-in there. If you assume there's no fixed costs associated with abatement technology, and instead you think of it as variable costs, this may be something that exhibits diminishing returns to scale. This idea that to clean up the first unit of pollution, it's relatively cheap. To clean up the millionth unit of pollution becomes really expensive. And you're absolutely right. If that's the case, eventually at some point, we kind of exhaust the economical opportunities for this process effect. So if you take that to the extreme and you say every single firm is using the same technology, so imagine we have a policy in place that mandates strict technology standards that literally says every firm that manufactures some car part has to use the exact same technology. Now, what this implies is that there's no gains from reallocation because everyone's using the same technology. And so, that actually seriously affects the channels we might see. But this is all relying on observed technology. The kind of implicit claim that essentially economics makes in almost any setting you discuss is that there are unobserved or hidden technological ideas out there that we might find through a process of searching. And that process of searching is, sometimes we call it innovation. There's lots of other different words we use for it. There's some sense that policy or the economic environment today might lead to that search, which will eventually pay off. But that's a risk. That's an uncertain and a risky process. So the key here, I think, for policymaking is getting a sense of the available technology that could be adopted now, what future changes in technology might look like, and then how the policy you choose today influences both the adoption of existing technology and the potential search for new technologies. And both of these rationales tend to be why economists really love market-based policies, because there's claims that they're better at doing both of these things. But this new technology thing is uncertain. So, we might run out of new ideas, in which case, there are potentially limits to cleaning up. Like, there's nothing here that says air pollution needs to be able to fall over time. All we've seen is that we've observed huge reductions, and now we're trying to understand why. That doesn't mean we can obtain those same reductions in the future. And that's potential, like your question highlights some of the mechanisms that would block that from happening.
Thank you.
Very nice. So, group 5.
So I was presenting for the Good Fridays. And so our question is regarding to the solution of upcoming pollution. As the of the scientists and the technology is the important factor in solving the pollution. There is always a limit on scientific development. So if our technology cannot improve anymore, the growth of pollution is over the growth of technology. In such a situation, will the composition play an important role to control the pollution? How can we use the composition to achieve the efficiency level of pollution?
Okay. Lots of people really interested in the limits to technology and what that imposes on policy. So you're absolutely right. I think kind of similar flavor to the previous question. If there is somehow a limit to new technology and what I call abatement technology, sort of anything that makes you cleaner. The way we think about this in the framework I just presented is, suppose the true technique effect is essentially zero. Now, like you said, that leaves composition changes, but it doesn't say there's no role for process. Now, remember, the process effect, changes in individual firm pollution intensity, comes from both this true technique effect, which is like a literal technological change that makes a task cleaner, as well as reorganization across tasks, changes in prices. In other words, if we can figure out a way to get more economic value out of a given unit of pollution, this actually meaningfully reduces pollution intensity, although that doesn't necessarily reduce pollution levels. And then sort of changing compositional changes in terms of who does what task. And so there might still be what seem like technological improvements available by reorganizing tasks either within the firm or around the firm. So even if we live in a world where new technology about abatement is zero, we might still be able to change the way we do things to clean up. But I agree completely. Composition becomes really important there. And then you start thinking about what kinds of policies create compositional changes. Well, a policy that differentially constrains industries or maybe more polluting industries are more heavily penalized than less polluting industries, that leads to a relatively large composition effect. Similarly, if you're thinking about changing the composition of a given industry, anything that differentially affects firms on the basis of their observed processes would deliver something similar. And so I think what you're pointing towards is, in that kind of world, maybe something that has explicit heterogeneity baked into it becomes more valuable. And that's actually in stark contrast to the way we think of economic policies motivated at environmental issues, where we tend to say uniform taxes are nice because they lead to equalized marginal abatement costs, which is still true. But if we're thinking about opportunities to reduce air pollution, and we think marginal abatement cost or technological options are non-existent, then maybe we start looking towards something that really leans into this compositional change. Mac, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, if we are stagnant in the process effect, so technology and everything is that, I can see shifts towards reallocation, and I'm blanking on the other one, but reallocation is the important one because that's what my question is about. Do we know if the reallocation effect is more driven by policy implications or consumer demand? So are consumers asking for different or greener products that is causing the reallocation effect versus government policy making it less costly to be, or more costly to be a polluter, causing reallocation effects?
Yeah, great question. I think in short, we don't know right now because there's relatively limited research pointing to the sources of these effects. So what I can say, based on my own work, is that in Canada, with regards to particulate matter pollution, the reallocation effect has been really large, and that's been a big part of that has been driven by some key policy changes. So in that sense, policy seems really important. But in terms of the relative magnitudes of this, both in other settings and generally the driver of policy versus consumer advocacy or changes in consumer preferences that lead to green consumerism and things like that, I think we don't have an answer to that in terms of a big picture question. So certainly an area for some interesting research because there's kind of competing views. One view of the world tends to be we need policy to solve all of these problems, and another view of the world says, well, or we can convince people to care about some of these externalities, and then it's going to do the same thing policy would, but without cumbersome political processes getting involved.
Very nice. Thank you very much. So we have group 2. So you can change the representative like every session. So it's not just one person talk. So you can make changes. Okay, if you like. Okay.
Hey, so we see that Canada's current climate plan is insufficient to reach its 1.5 degrees Celsius limit set forth by the Paris Climate Accord. And I was going to ask about technological progress, but you've talked about it a lot. So I just want to know what policies can be put in place to help our country reach those limits, and how important will technological improvement be in sectors that aren't like manufacturing, where you can achieve high levels of pollution reduction through that technique effect.
Okay, so first of all, this fact that we have a policy goal that our policies are insufficient to meet always confounds me. The number of presentations I've been at where someone from Environment Climate Change Canada has said, here's our target, and here's where we're going to get based on our modeling exercises in terms of the policies we've put in place. And you see this gap is pretty huge. What that basically says is we just don't have the stringency of policy we need. And so I think, the federal government's recent proposal to tighten the current federal framework should actually help a fair amount. So as it was, that framework was supposed to cap federal pollution or federal carbon tax at around $50 a ton. Now they've expanded that to a much higher level and a much more rapid increase in the level of that tax. And so that's that creates, even without changing the types of policies, just more stringent policy, particularly with something like a tax, in principle, could be enough to achieve whatever target you set up. Now, whether that's the most ethical or effective way, it's a big question. An economist or a typical economic analysis would say, well, a carbon tax or a cap and trade or any market-based policy would be the most cost-effective. That's not the same as saying that's the best policy, because we tend to care about cost effectiveness and efficiency, as well as equity and all sorts of other things. And so my personal opinion is that probably the right way to achieve that goal is pretty substantial carbon pricing, ideally through a tax or cap and trade mechanism, paired with other key policies, particularly when we think about addressing the potential regressivity of typical economic instruments, and providing some key incentives to adopt and implement and develop these new technologies that would, in theory, allow us to not drastically alter the composition of our domestic economy and still end up meeting our targets. And so that tends to be what we see the government trying to do. They've got a bunch of subsidies in place to try to increase technological adoption. Canada's particularly bad with the adoption piece. We are quite a leader in terms of various development of various technologies in the clean industry space. And then we've got no one using them in Canada. And so that means it really reduces the incentive to develop them, because then you've got to market them somewhere else. And so I've seen the government really focusing on that. So trying to build up the technical expertise and that market environment to help with the sort of technique effect, like we've been discussing, trying to lead to these adoption of new technologies and development of new technologies. And there's, we still got lots of really low-hanging fruit in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Changing in terms of grids, we're still seeing Canada phase out coal. That delivers huge reductions in emission intensity for greenhouse gases. If we get a cleaner grid, then that opens up the ability to reduce pollution from mobile sources. If people can then adopt an electric vehicle that charges on a clean grid, that really reduces transportation emissions versus building or getting an electric vehicle that plugs into a grid fueled by fossil fuels. That's much harder to do. But I think, it's not necessarily just new policies. A lot of it is just much stronger policy. It's, federally, we haven't had a coherent climate policy in place until relatively recently. We're still seeing court cases being fought over the validity of this policy, although I think that'll be resolved relatively soon. So, one answer is you just need more. Because we've done a lot more with air pollution, and we've seen many more improvements in air pollution relative to greenhouse gases.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So now we have a question from group 11. So we have 3 questions and 10 minutes. I don't know if we can have more of your time, Nouri, because at the end of this program, at the end of the session, I'm planning to have kind of encouraging those who are contributing the most to our forum discussions. I would like to have you there, in order to encourage these guys as well.
Yeah, I can stick around till 2:30. I've got another meeting at 2:30, so
all right. So
gives
thank
a little
you.
more time.
All right. Okay. So group 11.
Okay, our group have 3 questions, but given the time limit, we'll cut it down. So basically, we think that different regions have different relationship between air pollution and economic growth. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are 2 main possible patterns of this relationship. One is the U-shaped pattern, and the other is the inverted U-shaped pattern. So the former is often seen in non-metropolitan areas, whereas the latter is often seen in metropolitan areas. So our team suspects that the pattern for, let's say, Saskatchewan will be different than the pattern observed in Toronto. Now, given this different pattern observed in different regions in Canada, how does the government choose between different market mechanisms or policies to effectively reduce air pollution? And we're curious if you could talk a little bit about the key decision criteria.
Okay, really interesting question. And when we talk about a local pollutant or local pollution issues or transboundary pollution issues, like air pollution, this sort of leads to this natural question of regional disparities and how that how we incorporate that in policy. Whereas when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't matter the location of the emission of greenhouse gases. They do the same thing for everyone on the planet, with the obvious exception that the consequences of climate change vary by region. And so as a result, if we think about the start of my presentation, I said the reason we see policy on any of these air pollutants is pretty much because of human health and the effects that these air pollutants have on people. And so the way policy on air pollution has really been formulated has been this reliance on this belief that there's thresholds for air pollution exposure, where if you cross that threshold, the consequences become very severe. And if you're below that threshold, the consequences are much less severe. And so this view that the costs of air pollution are nonlinear. And so what we want to do is push air pollution away from the regions where it's the really heavily polluted regions into regions that are less polluted. And doing that will actually substantially reduce the consequences of air pollution. And so as a result, a lot of the policy initiatives we've seen for air pollution have relied on what are called air quality standards. So the US Clean Air Act, one of the main mechanisms there are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Canada has the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards. Europe has a whole series of air quality standards across the entire continent. We see them in India, and they're starting to be imposed in other parts of the world as well. What these are essentially doing is saying, we're going to set a threshold level of air pollution, and we're going to say every region of the country or every populated region of the country should be below that threshold. And if you get a region that's above that threshold, then the policy is essentially saying is it's too polluted there, and now you need to regulate firms that operate in that region to reduce their air pollution. And so that's been the predominant framework for air pollution policy in the last 50 or so years. And now what we're starting to see is better science on the relationship between air pollution and these various different consequences for humans, indicating that this strict threshold rule is probably wrong, in that there are still serious consequences of exposure to some of these pollutants, even at relatively low levels. So this sort of implies that relying on regional targeting is a really poor way to do policy. And so what this is moving people towards is the adoption of more broader forms of policy that might be pollution taxes or even technology standards that just apply broadly across a given country to try to address that. And so, that doesn't directly get at, I think, your sort of core of your question, but I think it hopefully helps you think about these regional differences and how that's informed policy. Basically, what's happening now is different than what we had done before, because we're starting to get a sense that the level of pollution doesn't matter as much as we thought. There's still serious costs associated with that.
Vanessa, did you get your answer?
I'm happy to provide more as well if you want to re-ask a question in response.
No, I think you already covered the most, like the part that we're most curious about. So thank you, and I guess we'll leave the time to other teams to ask their questions as well.
Okay. All right. So yeah, may I ask Group 9 to ask their question, please?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Our question is a bit looking at the policy side of things as well, but a more direct application to, below came up with overall. So with the cancellation of the cap and trade program in Ontario, the Federal Accountability Office estimates that the province's budget balance will worsen by about $3 billion. And the Ford government states that the measure was supposed to save households money, but reports are now bringing up that the cap and trade program would probably have saved households about twice the amount in the long term. So with emissions increasing by about 10 megatons of carbon dioxide between 2017 and 2018, do you think that cutting the cap and trade program was a good plan? I mean, on an efficiency basis, either in terms of financial savings for companies or consumers, did the cap and trade mechanism, which Ontario operated along with Quebec and California, did it fail to achieve the same externality internalizing effects as the later federally imposed carbon tax, which, I mean, in effect, for businesses, very much is a modified cap and trade program, isn't it? Or was this just plain old political nonsense?
Yeah, it was politics. That's pretty much it. There's no, as far as I can tell, there's no strong economic rationale as to why the previous cap and trade program was, bad and should be scrapped. And in particular, integrating with your key trading partner from an international competitiveness dimension is actually a really, really, really good idea. And so, I guess my simple answer is no, it was a bad idea, and the reason is probably entirely politically motivated. So if you ask any economists, they're probably going to tell you that some market-based mechanism should produce lower economic costs than another way of achieving the same level of GHG reduction. What we're sort of seeing is, I think, just a delay tactic. And so as the Supreme Court rulings on climate policy get handed down, we'll probably just end up in a situation with a policy that's more distorted and so imposes a higher aggregate cost in Ontario. And you might be able to justify that by saying, well, we care about, aggregate costs, but we also care about distributional implications. My concern is that you're going to end up in a worse situation on both. You're going to end up with a policy that probably favorably treats groups that don't need the support as much as other groups, and do so at a higher cost to the public. And so, there's really no other way to answer it. It's probably just a political game.
Do you expect the Supreme Court to side with the federal government?
I do. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll say everything in the federal backstop policy is okay, but I suspect they'll grant that the federal government has the authority to do sort of the types of policies they implemented with the backstop program. I know some lawyers who are involved, who are interveners in the case, and they seem to feel quite strongly that there will be that it will survive the challenge, but it's still not clear what elements will necessarily survive.
Makes sense. Thanks very much.